All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. Sorry about the delay. As I mentioned, this is the Child Welfare Information Technology System Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on the behalf of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. Today's roundtable features a distinguished panel from 2 states who will discuss their experiences collaborating with law enforcement. I am your host and facilitator for today's discussion, and we'll do introductions now. Next slide, please. All right, I'm very privileged to present a team from Florida, Travis Polk and Atari Hall. They will be joining us to talk about their experiences. And we have a whole gaggle of people from New Mexico. Primarily, we have Margaret Aragon de Chavez, Sandra Gallegos, Irene Lutkin, David Ramirez, but they have a whole team of people supporting them, and they will introduce themselves as they talk about different slides on today's agenda.
From Florida, Travis Polk is a manager with Criminal Justice Information Services, CJIS. Atari Hall is a child safety specialist. From New Mexico, Margaret Aragon de Chavez is the director of the CYFD Receiving Center, Community and Law Enforcement Outreach. Sandra R. Gallegos is the regional manager for statewide central intake. Irene Lutkin is chief information officer, and David Ramirez is IT Division Applications Development Manager.
A quick reminder to everyone participating in today's webinar. This is the first time we are using this new software, Zoom, so we appreciate your patience as we barrel through this. If there are any hiccups or concerns with the software, please send us a chat note. We'll have someone reading them to make sure everyone can hear and see our screens. At this time, all participant lines are muted, but we will open them up for the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. However, please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your screen, and those will be queued up and addressed during the Q&A session at the end. We encourage you to ask questions and participate and send any comments you may have as well. Once today's roundtable has ended, you may also submit additional questions to the email you see on the screen or to your federal analyst.
Please email questions to ccwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov.
The webinar PowerPoint we are using today will be made available to everyone on the listserv. So look for that in the next day or two. Okay, next slide, please. This will be a panel discussion. I will pose a series of questions on the topics you see on the slide here to the state panelists, which I trust will give rise to an informational as well as lively discussion.
The roundtable format and topics are as follows: description of exchange, technologies used, governance process, addressing changes or renewals, type of agreement, matching on the correct person, barriers to data sharing, which includes confidentiality issues, technology, and others, collaboration process to create the exchange, funding the exchange, and lessons learned/recommendations.
So without further ado, let's get into some of the questions. The first area is in the area of supporting child welfare and law enforcement, and Florida will be the first respondent for this first question. So Travis and Atari, please describe your exchange and how it supports the goals of child welfare and law enforcement. Travis and Atari, are you there?
Can you hear us?
Now we can. Great.
Okay.
Great. So I think data exchange can mean a lot of different things depending on the particular topic and the agency and et cetera. But for us, I created a slide that gets a basic definition, because at the core for this type of exchange, for the purpose of child protective investigations, it would be information obtained from law enforcement, courts, and other criminal justice agencies with the state that's vital for child welfare professionals such as investigators, for situational awareness, for safety, and when making safety decisions and assessments concerning children. some of the examples of types of things that we look at, it's not all inclusive, but would be patterns of assault, battery, and criminal behaviors, sexual assault, but also beyond just a criminal history, also hot files that might be contained in state and national criminal history, data sources like open arrest warrants, household members on probation, parole, protection orders, and status files like sexual offender, predator, those type of things.
Other examples include domestic and/or family violence, substance abuse, crimes against children, resisting arrest with violence, and other crimes involving violence.
As far as our model itself, if we go to the next slide, I just put some quick bullets. The core of our model and how we operate for obtaining criminal history information is our CWIS system, which is a Afforded Safe Families Network. It's used by our investigators and child welfare professionals as a system, since they're already using it for their cases, for the investigations and services cases. We've built functionality into our CWIS system where they can actually request criminal history, access that criminal history. And our model employs an actual 24/7 crime intelligence unit housed by crime intelligence analysts to provide subject matter expertise when reviewing criminal histories, as well as staff that can make some levels of, for certain types of checks, determinations like our placements on if it's safe to place a child, if it meets statutory criteria. And I put couple of other bullets on here. We also have the ability through the CWIS system to transmit child-on-child sexual abuse special condition reports directly to the appropriate sheriff office through our state law enforcement system. So it goes directly to the appropriate sheriff office. Our access in our system, since it's all controlled through the FISP and our CWIS system, is controlled by user roles. So we have several different types of roles that allow different levels of access to the criminal history information. Investigators have more access to certain information types than, say, a caseworker. We also have the capability, something that we're proud of through the CWIS system. We built functionality that connects to state law enforcement. We built missing child modules for reporting missing child episodes and recoveries. It's communicated to our state law enforcement and to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So we're very proud of that. And again, I think at the core of our model would be our CWIS system, kind of as our application and data source for managing the workloads and the requests, and our crime intelligence unit providing subject matter expertise. That's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much. New Mexico, the same question.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. We do have a team here at Children, Youth, and Family that has been working on this for a very long time, and the whole vision of what we were trying to accomplish was sharing information to let law enforcement know a little bit of the history of a family when they were going to do a visit. Unfortunately, it took we had a death of a young child by the name of Omari. I need to honor him by his name. That in the last governor's administration came up with the idea of sharing information and created an executive order. And I'll just read you one little portion of that executive order where basically it involves our central intake, a referral line to becoming a source of information that law enforcement can access to obtain historical protective service information that includes information on the child's parents, guardians, and custodians who were the subject to any prior investigations and or case history that includes the number of prior referrals, the dates of prior referrals, investigative decisions, or of unsubstantiated or substantiated prior referrals and any other case history that may affect the important safety decisions of a child. So with that executive order, we have come up with the law enforcement portal, which gives access to our fax system which will let law enforcement know prior calls to the home and a snapshot of the history of that family and any red flags that are there in that home. That's our vision.
All right, thank you so much. Next slide, please. So next we're going to be talking about the technologies. Sorry, I just told myself to use the next slide. So we're going to hear from New Mexico first, and our question is, what technologies are used for the exchange?
Hi, this is Jeremy Kai. So we had a small team that basically uses, as far as technology, we use Java web services, and our client is a JavaScript AngularJS application. We basically use like continuous delivery to deploy a lot of our changes like really quick, so that way we can get a really fast feedback loop with the end users. So while they're testing, if something's found, we can make a change really quick, commit that change, and typically a lot of our deployments are like less than 30 seconds. So if something's found, we can make the change and we can get feedback like that same day or same morning. So that really helped us as far as being able to make changes. And so we use Kanban to manage our work. So the main thing that we use is the philosophy of work in progress. We want to make sure that the things that we're working on, people are aware of that. We typically break our work up into one-day tasks. It can take not the full one day, but at least one day. So that way, we always know that there's a task that's being worked on, and so Kanban allows us to track that really easily. And we use Trello to do that. And we use internally we use Slack to talk to our system administrators. So we have really close communication with our sysadmins. I guess a lot of times people refer to that as DevOps. So that's kind of what we use as well.
For New Mexico, Lean Software Development and DevOps, applying lean thinking and concepts of the product development process. Bullet points include small cross-functional team working closely with customers, continuous integration and delivery, building quality and speed up builds and deployments. Continuous feedback loop with short iteration cycles. Amplifies learning, validates design, and reduces risk. Kanban to plan, manage, and track progress. Team empowerment, no micromanagement. Deliver fast and eliminate waste. Avoid over-engineering technical solutions and business requirements.
I think that's a fairly quick synopsis. Is that sufficient?
Absolutely, and I think you have one more slide too about the technology stack.
So the first box is really gives you an idea of what we're using. We use Redis for storing a lot of our search requests. So any request that comes in from the law enforcement agencies is logged and kept in Redis. Nginx is used for serving our web pages, and it's also used for our reverse proxy, so that way we can manage all of our servers behind our reverse proxy. We use Keycloak for single sign-on, so that's a product from Red Hat. So we use that to create realms for like law enforcement, internally for our own CYFD applications. We also have other applications that we're working on. We use JavaScript and AngularJS for the web pages, for the law enforcement portal, and of course we use Java on the back end. The next one is, like we mentioned, Trello and Slack. So Trello is used, we use that for our Kanban and tracking our work in progress. We use Slack for internal communications. Our development pipeline, when we commit changes, sends messages to our Slack channel. So anyone who's on that Slack channel gets notifications for deployments. We also have logging and monitoring, so that if, say, we lose a connection to a database, it gets logged to our Slack channel. So we're aware of when we lose a connection, or if one time I think we had a file system that went into read-only mode, and so we got a notification in that. So we try to keep track of a lot of those day-to-day issues that come up sometimes. Elasticsearch is used for our search. So initially when we developed the law enforcement portal, it was like a simple SQL query. So like exact first name, exact last name, and that was just kind of to prove the concept. But when people started using it, we kind of pushed that off towards the end while we had like free cycles. And so around January of 2017 is when we implemented Elasticsearch, and that gave us the ability to do better searching than what was available in the legacy application. So all our applications use Elasticsearch for searching. We keep our code in version control, Git. We purchased a license for GitHub Enterprise. So our development pipeline, all our commits go into GitHub, and we use Jenkins to manage all that. I think that's everything on there.
Thank you so much for that. Next, we'll hear from Florida. Similar question. What is the technologies you're using in yours?
For the state of Florida, systems and data sources used to support Florida DCF CJIS operations and processes are the Florida Safe Families Network, FSFN, the Florida Crime Information Center, FCIC, the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, the Florida Clerk of the Court Comprehensive Case Information System, CCIS, FDLE CJNet for the intranet system, FDLE Falcon system and LiveScan devices, the Florida Juvenile Justice Information System, JJIS, FDLE Civil Workflow Control System, CWCS, CJIS Online and Next Test Training Systems, Florida Driver and Vehicle Information System, DAVID, VPN and IRM Policy Server, and Criminal Justice and Non-Criminal Justice ORIs.
Well, unfortunately, my tech rep couldn't make it in time, so I can't get into that level of detail, but I can mention kind of from a little bit of a higher level that since we're using our CWIS system as the primary application for requesting and accessing criminal histories for our investigators, that is the system that actually logs all requests and contains our crime intelligence unit's workload for processing those. It's connected to an FDLE circuit, and we use an FDLE router for access. And the main information that we're accessing is referred to here in Florida as CJNet. That's the Department of Law Enforcement's criminal justice network that's available to all law enforcement agencies and criminal justice agencies in Florida. And we store our information. Our CWIS system is actually in the cloud, so we store our criminal justice information that we obtain from CJNet onto a policy server that's separate and housed here at DCF headquarters at our Florida Youth Hotline. As far as law enforcement accessing our information, through that Department of Law Enforcement CJNet network that I mentioned, we provide law enforcement with direct accounts to our CWIS system. They have their own user role and can request accounts, and they access through the CJNet network maintained by the Department of Law Enforcement. And anytime that our investigators are accessing any rap sheets and et cetera that have to be protected according to federal policy, we're using, and this might be skipping ahead a little bit, but we use an XSL encryption for accessing that information. And here on this slide that I created, it's just several different data sources and et cetera that our folks in crime intelligence access. But again, law enforcement here in Florida, for them to get information directly as users, we provide actual accounts upon request that they access through the CJNet Department of Law Enforcement network. That's all I have.
All right, thank you, Travis. So if anyone on the call was interested in learning more about some of that technology, could they contact you after the webinar at some other time?
we can definitely get them to the right person to talk to. So definitely please send us an email and we can get you right where you need to go. I think one of the things that's very unique that I was listening to from New Mexico was that it sounds like their law enforcement accesses as a result of that particular case they had has a lot more direct access via the portal to the actual abuse report for the person. And so I think with us, that is something that we've had more of some legislative proposals recently in regards to something very similar in nature. And so I do definitely like what you guys are doing, and I may be reaching out to you guys because that may be something that we may need some more information about for that to use. But I think our request more so, I would say, would you say, Travis, is maybe more so from our law enforcement standpoint, except for those that are handling child protective investigations, tend to deal with, they'll contact us locally to request any, information that they may need as it relates to the family's abuse report history.
That's correct, and again, in combination with certain law enforcement agencies may have direct accounts, like our Department of Law Enforcement, through the CJNet network, but probably more often, on a local level, law enforcement will contact our local office, which is probably what they do throughout the U.S. commonly.
Oh, some great information. Thank you. Next, we're going to go out and talk about governance. So what governance process for the exchange of data being shared has been established? In Florida, I'll ask you to start.
Well, sure. And when I created my slide, being that I'm more policy and practice, my governance concerns more of a policy structure. So, and with obtaining information from law enforcement more in mind than sharing law enforcement.
For Florida Exchange of Criminal Justice Information, governance includes CJIS Advisory Policy Board, CJIS Systems Officers, CJIS Working Groups, CJIS Subcommittees, FBI CJIS Information Security Officer, and FBI Director. For operations, CSA Information Security Officers, CJIS Systems Agencies, Compact Officers, Local Agency Security Officers, Repository Managers, and Terminal Agency Coordinators. For policy structure/design, laws and directives, security policy and implementation standards. Security standards are National Institute of Standards and Technology, International Standards Organization, and Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers.
So, from our perspective, with obtaining state and national criminal history being the primary information of interest, that really starts with the FBI and the CJIS Advisory Policy Board for investigations and the Privacy Compact Council for those non-criminal justice functions like placements. So it starts kind of with the FBI and those councils, and it moves on to your head law enforcement agency in your state, and the policy structure that we're required to follow for information access all the way through security is really starts with the FBI CJIS security policy. And it goes through, I think we're going to discuss it in a bit, but UA agreements with your law enforcement agencies. So again, my slide's more on policy structure. As far as information access, we control, again, through our CWA system. It's really based on your user role. We have, of course, various types of user roles, and we're able to control what type of information you're able to receive based on your role. That's assigned. We have roles for investigators, caseworkers, et cetera.
And then several of those roles, I would say, can't even or may not, they aren't able to access some of the information at all. So you do have to have a designated type of profile, I would say, in some of these situations, most of the situations, to access certain things that may be related to that person's particular criminal history, such as your nationals and your FDLE. Locals and things such as our clerk of court's office, those information, injunctions, and things of that level are a little more flexible, and the access is a lot more open as to who has that immediate access and information. Here in Florida, I will say we do get audited. And we do deal with audits in regards to how we handle that information, how we process that information, whether we are storing that information, the retention of any of that information, how we're storing it, if we're removing it from our files, as far as our paper copies and different things like that, we do get evaluated on.
And so the next slide is just I thought it might be helpful for any agencies out there that haven't attempted to obtain, say, national criminal history, to list out the two different boards on the national level, depending on the purpose that you were wanting to obtain national information. Might be helpful. So again, the Criminal Justice Information Services Advisory Board will be the primary board for obtaining information for investigations, and the National Crime Prevention and Privacy Competent Council would be the primary council working with the FBI concerning non-criminal justice purposes such as placements.
For Florida, national boards and councils include, for criminal justice, Criminal Justice Information Services, CJIS, Advisory Board, APB, responsible for reviewing policy, technical, and operational issues related to the National Crime Information Center, NCIC. It meets minimally twice yearly and makes recommendations to the Director of the FBI for final approval. Non-criminal justice, the National Crime Prevention and Privacy Compact Council. The Compact Council, as a national independent authority, works in partnership with criminal history record custodians, end users, and policymakers to regulate and facilitate the sharing of complete, accurate, and timely criminal history record information to non-criminal justice users in order to enhance public safety, welfare, and security of society while recognizing the importance of individual privacy rights.
That's just all we have.
All right, thank you so much for that explanation. New Mexico, you don't have a slide, but could you address the governor's process for your exchange of data?
I believe that would go on to our journey. It talks a little bit about the governance of what we've needed to do. There we go. So basically, as I mentioned, the governor's executive order was done in 2014. There was a process of putting a committee together, which got a little stalled, and in fact, we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned a little bit later, that our first basic information exchange with law enforcement was called a virtual desktop initiative, which we'll get into with lessons learned. But so the executive order was done in 2014, which kind of ignited the idea of sharing information with law enforcement. I do need to interject, I really like what Florida's doing. In fact, that's one of the discussions that we're having now is we feel like we're giving to law enforcement, but we want law enforcement to give back to us. And some of the, reports and some of the domestic violence issues that we'd like to get that information back. So the executive order was kind of like the starting point for where we started. Obviously, the state of New Mexico is a large state, so what we decided to do, and we'll talk a little bit about it, is we had a pilot program with the Department of Safety, since it is one of our sister agencies in the state of New Mexico, and it's the Department of Safety. First of all, though, what we had to do before we even got to that point was to create a memorandum of understanding. The memorandums of understanding were created by our legal department in Children, Youth, and Families Department, which had the language of basically a legal jargon to make sure that policy was in place and this is what it could be used for and what it could not be used for. The memorandum of understanding, we had one for 3 years, and we just implemented our second memorandum of understanding, which we added language that wasn't in the first memorandum of understanding, is that it is at this point we have almost about 25 to 30 memorandums of understanding across the state. So the one thing that we wanted to know in the memorandum of understanding is when an employee separates from an agency, they need to let us know within 24 hours so that they cannot get access into the portal any longer. So that is something, to look at. So now our next one will be due again in 2023, I believe. That's when we will be filling out more memorandums of understanding. I'd like to talk a little bit about the collaboration and coordination. We started with the pilot program, which somebody will be talking a little bit about in the next couple of minutes. But something that's been really important in order to grow the law enforcement portal is, we came up with the training where trainers law enforcement would come in and they would get trained on our site. The other thing that's been really important is just trying to reach out to the different law enforcement. So I have a staff of 2, and what we did is we very methodically went over every law enforcement agency in the state of New Mexico, got phone numbers, contacted them. Then we had a northern and a southern summit where we brought law enforcement from all over the state of New Mexico. We had our very experienced trainers do a demo of what the law enforcement portal could offer them. And so that collaboration and that coordination immediately after the summit really ignited us being able to get more memorandums of understanding signed. So next, I believe they'll be talking about the pilot program.
The VDI?
Yes.
So the VDI virtual desktop, this is Sandra Gallegos from Statewide Central Intake. We were approached to participate in this training and create the training for the New Mexico State Police. And what was awesome was that we already had training in place for our intake workers. So I immediately had my very talented senior worker assist in this, and she provided training material that would be used and which we have in the past few years kind of created to fit what we do now for the portal. But initially it was created by a senior worker, which we use for our intake workers, which has expanded to our law enforcement. The VDI was a pilot, was not very successful. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, but it was not successful. It was expensive, and if you want to go ahead.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later on lessons learned. I think we're going to go over that, so I think we can kind of skip over that
we can skip.
and get to it a little bit later. I mentioned a little bit about the summits that we had, and so we had quite a few. We had over 125 law enforcement agencies across the state come to these northern and southern summits, and part of that process was had to be very specific because we had to get IT involved to make sure that we could support the demo.
Right, so in preparation for the summit from an IT perspective, we had to ensure the technology was in place to accommodate a large audience with access to the portal for the demonstration.
Yes. And getting over media coverage, that it has been important because of the high visible cases that we've had here within CYFD, and unfortunately, as any child welfare system incurs once in a while, is unfortunate death in our system. And so the media coverage was very high that we were actively trying to do something to work with law enforcement to create a better partnership that we could work together to create a safer New Mexico. The training, we have a couple of our expert trainers here. We have Shannon and Roxanne. They are both experts in 2 different areas because our Children, Youth, and Families Department is not just a protective service agency. We also deal with juvenile justice. Would you like to say any word about the juvenile justice training?
Oh.
Yes.
Hi, this is Shannon. I was a probation officer for several years out in Valencia County, which is the southern county of New Mexico, a very rural county. And I have to really adapt my training to the law enforcement individuals because the way the juvenile laws in New Mexico are read and prosecuted are completely different than they are in the adult system. So law enforcement really doesn't have an idea of how the juvenile system works, even in our own state, because it is so vastly different. So I train them not only on juvenile law, but what information is housed inside of our portal, because it's very, very different than it is for protective services or anything else under this umbrella of CYFD. So that's what I do.
Thank you. This is Roxanne Lentz. I work for Statewide Central Intake, part of Protective Services. So with training similar to what Shannon does with juvenile justice, when I do the training, when I present the law enforcement portal to law enforcement, not only do I show them how the application works, but I also give them examples on how they could apply it in real life. And I also take time to explain how Child Protective Services works so they understand why some reports would meet criteria for us to investigate or why it wouldn't. Throughout the trainings, Shannon and I both use great examples to help engage the audience. We also utilize what we call scavenger hunts, where we give them information on someone to look up, and then we give them a chance to use the tool right there while we're all there to support them. So if they have any questions about how to search or what they're looking at, we're there to assist them as well.
One thing I'd like to add, thank you, Roxanne and Shannon, is that the one thing that is really excellent about the trainers that we do have is they actually reach out to law enforcement, which they're coming from different counties, different entities, and we ask them, give us a name. What is the case that you're looking into right now? And that really ignites their interest, and it lets them know that it can really help them and assist them in the case that they're working on. And that's all we have to say at this moment. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. For Florida, could you tell us a little bit about what agreements you have, whether they're MOUs or interagency agreements with your law enforcement partners?
So I can speak to the local levels. I will say for each of the local levels within the jurisdiction, they have, there's a variety of things. Some of them do use the MOU, some of them use the MOAs. For instance, we had a very recent change to policy regarding how we respond to institutional reports on foster homes. Some of the interpretation was that law enforcement was to go out on each of those. And so some areas had written that into their working agreements with law enforcement that they would respond to those reports. And so there had to be an amendment to those agreements. And so you found one area, I mean, for instance, our more metro areas such as Orlando, there was a total of, in that central region, I think they had to modify 64 different MOAs or MOUs in response to how they would work, how they would work with each other. Now, as far as the governance that allowed us to do that, all of those things are within statute, that our Florida statutes that tell us how we must work together, what we need to do, and allow us to come together at that local level to implement how we need to operate. And so most of those things, as far as, what our agreements look like and what they entail as far as they're outside of that initial base of requirements, is down to that level, whether they're giving us access to their call-outs to the home, their CAD calls, just to know how many times they responded, because statutorily it's already required that they provide us with 911 call-outs. But how they do that is more flexible, whether that means they're giving our CPIs direct access to that information or whether they're pulling it for us and providing it to us within a certain time frame. So I'll let Travis go from there.
I don't have a whole lot more to add, but our side is kind of focused on us obtaining information from other state agencies, really. So we have a criminal justice user agreement with our Department of Law Enforcement for Florida criminal history, as well as national criminal history from the FBI. We have multiple non-criminal justice user agreements, which cover all the reasons, as I'm sure most agencies already have, that we fingerprint for, like adoptions, licenses, child placement. We have a different user agreement for each one of those purposes in Florida statute. We also have user agreements with the Florida Department of Highway Safety Motor Vehicle, where we can pull driver's license photos, vehicle information, et cetera. We have user agreements for the exchange of information with our Department of Juvenile Justice, our state clerk of the court, and also mentioned we have multiple possible scenarios for agreements at the local level with sheriff offices, and I'll mention something along those lines about some of the barriers we come across when it comes to local law enforcement agencies in a little bit. But that's basically all I have. Is I thought it might be helpful for other states to see what type of user agreements that we have in order to obtain information from other criminal justice and law enforcement state level agencies. That's it.
All right, thank you. Thank you both. So as a follow-up to some of these comments you've both been making, you both obviously had to work with a lot of different entities within the state. Tell us a little bit about how you came together, what brought you together. You both touched upon that, but we'd like to hear a little bit more. So,
just to make sure I understand your question, are you talking about how we created the relationships with law enforcement, other entities across the state?
Absolutely, that would be excellent.
Well, you know, like I said, the most important thing that we were able to accomplish was putting on these law enforcement summits. You know, when we have high-profile cases in the state of New Mexico, every, obviously, newspaper gets a hold of them, and they're quite visible to everyone. And so we thought that the perfect timing was to bring people together, you know, talk about, you know, the safety of children, and, you know, it was also a really wonderful time for law enforcement in the southern part of the state and the northern part of the state to network together with our workers, our investigative workers. And at our summits, what we did is we had protective services investigators there divided up into counties to talk about, you know, what they're needing from law enforcement and what law enforcement was needing from us. And so we broke out in small groups at these summits, and we were able to become, you know, better acquainted with one another and to build that relationship. You know, I'm a true believer that, and I think all of us are sitting at the table, is relationships just don't happen, they're built. And they're built on trust, they're built on trying to meet the needs of each other. And so hearing what law enforcement needed from us and us telling them within our boundaries of the Children's Code of what we could give to them really brought us closer together of an understanding of what information needed to be shared and what information didn't need to be shared. And the other thing that was really important is right after the summits was the important timing of getting back to them. You know, if you have a summit and you don't reach out to these people within a month, you know, they're just going to forget about what we did. What we did is we immediately reached out to them the following Monday, you know, saying, how can we get this started? And the exciting thing about it is we had Sheriff's Department, we have, you know, like city police officers, FBI, DA's office. They are all involved within our within the portal.
And if I could elaborate, this is Irene. Could we have the next slide, please? So Margaret talked about external collaboration, who are considered our customers. Internally, and as important, was the internal collaboration with our governor's office, the Office of the Secretary, our Protective Services Division, Juvenile Justice Division, the Information Technology Division, and of course, the New Mexico law enforcement community. So previously mentioned, we applied lean software development and DevOps to this project from a technology stack perspective. And what's key to the success is the fact that the development team worked very closely with small functional teams to do the requirements gathering. The juvenile justice subject matter experts were excellent in providing those requirements, as were the protective services subject matter experts. And ongoing collaboration, continuous feedback, which is part of what, you know, lean software development is all about. The continuous feedback with this working style is key to its success.
Thank you so much, Irene and others. From Florida, anything you wanted to add to that?
I would only add that I think I would agree with every point that New Mexico just made 100%. For us, as far as how we kind of got here, I mentioned on the slide, I think one down, that it really, on the national criminal history, started for us with Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act back in 2006. We worked in partnership with the Department of Law Enforcement to advocate for that in Washington, D.C., for access to national criminal history through the FBI for the purpose of child protective investigations. And that was a major change for us. And until that point, we only accessed state criminal history, and largely for placements, for child placements and home studies. And so that really kind of changed things for us. Certainly partnering with Department of Law Enforcement is kind of a theme on my slides over and over. This is of extreme importance since your state Department of Law Enforcement agency will probably be your primary CJIS agency and the agency within your state that has a user agreement with the FBI. It's of extreme importance, and we actually kind of go so far as my office actually, when it's appropriate, embeds certain employees for certain types of tasks and roles at FDLE headquarters here in Florida. So I have a staff member who works full-time at the Missing Persons Clearinghouse. We have staff assigned for roles with our CJIS division over there that concerns information exchange, obtaining that state and national criminal history. And we also dedicate staff to participating with our Florida Fusion Centers, which gets into intelligence information sharing between state agencies. So, again, partnerships. If you haven't taken a look at what types of information can you get via the Adam Walsh Child Protective Safety Act, I would certainly recommend it.
And I think for us, luckily our statute has really supported our collaboration efforts for years, being able to get information and how we work together. And so luckily with that, and most of our at the local level and regional level, we've been fortunate enough to have, good administrators who just really work pretty well with most of the sheriff's offices or the city police forces in order to get the information that they need. And so I think it's a plus for us as well as in Florida, kind of how we're structured. Our Secretary of the Department of Children and Families and the sheriffs of all of the counties in Florida, they all both report to the governor of the state. And so he is their boss. And so when there are issues, or if there is an issue, which it's very rare most times, they, have that ability to communicate about what those issues are and who's responsible for what, and if there needs to be some change that occurs between our agencies and the sheriff's agencies.
Well, you both sound like you really work cooperatively with your partner agencies. We're interested in hearing a little bit about how you plan to sustain that relationship and improve it over time. So New Mexico, why don't you go first?
All right. Well, and please, anybody who's here, just jump in. Obviously, the community outreach is very important. Being able to, have current emails, keeping up with changes of elected sheriffs because they are elected in New Mexico and the administration's changed, so it's keeping up with the correct serve list of who we're going to reach out to. It's also making sure that we're checking back with them. It's one thing to come to the class, get them their credentials, but it's also important, the credentials, that's something I should mention. If they do not log in within 30 days, they lose their credentials, and they have to call us and reach us to make sure that we can give them an updated password to renew their credentials. And that's something the IT department is very good at. They get back with them within hours. Let's see. The other thing that is important is the dedicated resources for community outreach. Go ahead.
Of which Margaret is. So she is a dedicated resource for community outreach, and that's one of the things that is key to the success of collaboration with law enforcement is continuous communications.
And so thank you, Irene. And that is something that's really important. The one thing that, sometimes what we do is I'll send an email out and just say, have you found it useful? What would you like to see added to the portal? So we reach out to the law enforcement classes, and that's something that we are going to need to, to grow is, obviously dollars. And it's something we have just gotten a new governor, and we're hoping to meet with we had a very successful training in the last 3 months. We were able to train our largest metro police department within, we had 4 trainings every Thursday at their headquarters, and we did this for, I believe it was close to 9 weeks. We trained over 682 officers who now have credentials to use the law enforcement portal. So, meeting with them one-on-one, trying to figure out how we can make sure we meet their needs. We usually do our trainings here, but in order to get them all trained, we worked with them and we went down to their offices every Thursday for the last 9 weeks and had that accomplishment. Last Thursday got a lot of press. The lieutenant governor was there, and so we're hoping to ask them, that if we can create a 5-year plan of what we need to expand this, that it is in the hands of every law enforcement entity across the state of New Mexico. The exciting thing with the Albuquerque Police now is that the next phase of it will be is that we're going to be integrated into their training academy. So in other words, instead of getting trained after, they're going to be trained before they hit the field, which is very exciting. I've talked a little bit about the ongoing training and feedback. Let's talk a little bit about digital service investments. Dave, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Actually, I think I'll let these guys talk to them because they're the ones that are actually doing all the work. But I will tell you this, that when we first started, we knew that we have a legacy system. So we knew we had to become a little bit more nimble. We had to become more agile. So that's how digital services was kind of born. And they went out and actually kind of looked to see where can we help CYFD, where can we help the kids of New Mexico. So that was kind of their mission statement at that time. And so now now that we've developed this and we've developed some other portals and dashboards for CYFD, and now it's more about investing in this area of technology. And so that's kind of where we're kind of heading, and these guys are kind of leading that charge as to what kind of tools are available, how do we build our infrastructure. And so I'll let them talk a little bit more about that.
This is Jeremy again. I think from a technical perspective, I think we just kind of we did this probably within 6 months maybe, just kind of evolved, week to week. We worked with a lot of staff from statewide central intake and JJS, just testing a lot of our software. But a lot of what we wrote was really just minimal and small, and so that we could test the idea. So I think now that we're getting a lot of agencies access and a lot of accounts, we do see some parts where we can improve. We're connected directly to the legacy database that our SACWA system runs with or is connected to. So I think one of the things that we want to try and do, and what we're working on now, is trying to cache the data so that if the database, the legacy database goes down, then we're still operable. So right now, if that's one of our things that we're kind of looking at, is because if the database goes down, then law enforcement obviously can't do a search or find the data that they need. So that's one of the improvements and one of the things that we're looking towards, and updating the user interface. I think that's another thing that we're probably targeting. But just maintenance, more or less. I think we proved that the idea works at this point. I think that now we want to see how can we make it better, and I think that's kind of a discussion that folks above us can have, because we're just kind of like the guys doing the work. I mean, there was 2 developers, myself and Manuel. We had a project manager, Carmelina, and we had an ops person, Lorenzo, and that's how we started. It was the 4 of us. Right now there's 3 of us left, but that's kind of what the size of team what we're talking about earlier. It's a small team.
A small team, but you were able to get a lot of work done, so kudos to you. Florida, any plans on expanding what you've done or strategies for sustaining?
So there's always new things on the horizon, especially every legislative session, something new approaches. And a lot of the things that or if there's just something that we recognize is repeatedly an issue or something that comes up that we need to address. Luckily, we really try to evaluate when we're looking at policy changes and different required changes that come about as it relates to legislative sessions, who our stakeholders are, who do we need at the table, who do we need to get involved, and at what level, and if there needs to be communication from our headquarters level, from our office, or from Florida Department of Law Enforcement as it relates to what's going to happen or what's about to happen. And a lot of the work is done as it relates to how we process stuff and create policies are done with those key stakeholders at the table. So we bring in the experts of who's doing it every day, how is it going to impact them, what do they need from us, how do we need to, what do we need to consider in our development of laws, in our development of policies. Even when the legislature proposes certain policies, we get to write up our analysis of what is the impact on our agency. All of the agencies that could potentially be impacted by the particular policies gets to give feedback. What is it going to cost us? And if it's going to cost us, how easily doable is this? What do we need the resources to make things happen? And so there's a lot of collaboration that goes on very early in advance, most times even before it gets written or codified into law. Sometimes, there are things that we may not necessarily always agree with, or they're not, I won't say don't agree with, but there are things that are not easily implementable for us, and so it causes a challenge in how we have to approach it. And so we go about those things and try and work as best we can together. We're pretty flexible. And we do well overall as far as our training and as far as our feedback and how we work with each other. FCLE hosts a lot of conferences and meetings. We're typically first on the list for who gets invited, and it's equally so for us. Even at the local level, when we bring specialists in, we bring in national experts, we keep seats available for law enforcement, our local law enforcement, especially when it's specific to child interviews or specific to different techniques for talking to people. So we try and collaborate at various different levels. They host conferences and the statewide conferences as well. And so, or we conduct them jointly. We have a Crimes Against Children conference that occurs here in Florida every year. And so law enforcement is heavily involved in that and participate and attend, and just people from across the nation. And so we take part in that as well. We provide some of the funding in that. We train in that as well. And so our role is very strategic, and we try and think those things out. We also have a initiative. Our new secretary that was just recently appointed by our new governor has also created a priority of effort to strengthen our relationship with with law enforcement agencies due to a recent case that we had. So they want to strengthen it. They were concerned. They were being new to this particular arena, that maybe we need to communicate even further. And so we're looking at that. How can we get information or share information even quicker as it relates to I think earlier someone had said, and even Travis said in this room, we're looking at this call. From this call, we've been sharing information about what we do very differently. It seems Florida is in the more so receiving mode of information from law enforcement, and Mexico is giving it. And so we're really trying to make sure on the giving end, we can do that much faster here in Florida. And so those are some of the things that we're working on as it relates to trying to sustain those good relationships and talking.
Wow, thank you so much. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on lessons learned and hear from both states, and then we'll open up the lines and the Q&A for our participants. As a reminder, you can submit questions in our Q&A, and several of you have already. So we will talk about the last question here, and then we will go to questions. So lessons learned, and starting with Florida. For states interested in building similar exchanges with their law enforcement partners, what are your recommendations or some lessons learned?
I think a common theme of the full presentation today from both states will be partnership. I can't emphasize enough the partnership that is needed when we're talking about obtaining state and national criminal history that you need with your state CJIS agency, your Department of Law Enforcement. For us, it's FDLE. Of identifying who with that agency is also your state's representative with the FBI, with those two councils, national councils and boards we were talking about earlier. It's really important. Then I just threw some other considerations that you'll need if you're obtaining or trying to get this information for the first time, which is your statutory authority, the interagency user agreements you'll need. Those are the kind of things you'll work with your Department of Law Enforcement with. Depending on how much information that you're going to get, say national, you're going to be compliant with the CJIS security policy and DIPA when it comes to driver's license information. What type of practice model that you're going to want to employ with your state? If you want a centralized unit of analysts, kind of like what we employ here in Florida currently, or if you want a decentralized process, if you want your frontline workers accessing and pulling that information directly, from your circuits and regions.
Two other things to consider are interagency user agreements and service model types, examples, software, platform, and infrastructure.
Those kind of things. And then I think on my next slide, I just threw out some other examples of how we exchange information that's not necessarily focused just on investigations, just for ideas for other states. Like we exchange information with DJJ to identify joint clients. We exchange information with the Agency for Healthcare Administration here in Florida, the Department of Health, and APD, which is
Agency for Persons with Disabilities.
Agency for Persons with Disabilities. So those are just some other examples. Yes. But I think for our lessons learned, it's the importance of partnerships with those agencies, most especially your lead agency in your state for law enforcement.
Additional data sharing examples include Department of Juvenile Services, DJJ, for the purpose of identifying joint clients, the Agency for Healthcare, AHCA, for enrolling children in the Child Welfare Specialty Plan, Medicaid, AHCA for pharmacy data for children in other healthcare, OHC, the Department of Health for assessing referrals to their Early Step program, the Agency for Persons with Disabilities, APD, for the purpose of identifying joint clients, and APD also for identifying APD clients who have been abused or neglected.
And one of the things that we do or that has been implemented in the state that has been very beneficial, we have statewide meetings with all of these agencies that we have talked about. If they interact or we have families that at some point cross over between all of our agencies, we're all coming to the table at least once a month. The hosting of the meetings is rotated. And so we get to have a discussion. And one of the requirements of this particular statewide meeting or task force is that it gets broken down at each level. So for Florida, we have it at the state level, then we also have it at the regional level, and then we have sometimes they do it at the local level. It's required at the local level, and this is how we process through issues or problems. If they're not able to be worked out locally or at the circuit or regional level first, and then it makes it all the way up to the state meeting, and then parties who are at that table through an MOA are able to determine, hey, this is what we have available, this is what we can move to get this situation done, and how we're going to go about doing it. And we just recently updated our MOA as it relates to that group. And so we try and bring everybody to the table to work. And so that's one of the key things, figuring out what works for everybody, what doesn't work. But that statutory authority is going to be the most important thing that you can have and hold to support you.
Thank you so much, Florida. New Mexico, what are some of your lessons learned?
This is Margaret from New Mexico. I believe that we've come a long way, and there's a long road ahead of us. As mentioned before, we started with the virtual desktop initiative, which you had to be, connected to the wall, on a desktop. We have grown, and now, officers can access it through their mobile phones, their laptops, and so I think that we realized that it was very expensive the way we were doing it at the very beginning. It was $1,000 per license, and we just knew that we wouldn't have the money to sustain it. And it was kind of archaic. We need to, get into the times, and so now it's web-based. So that's one of the lessons learned, that there's a better way and a more effective way. Plus, the usage was very down when we had the virtual desktop because it was so cumbersome. Now it's at their fingertips, and it's being used, which is very exciting. The other thing that I think that we are realizing is that, even though law enforcement, child protective services, there's a lot of entities that we tend to live in our own little bubbles, and I think that the one thing we have to overcome is, turf issues. If there's information that can protect the life of a child, there needs to be more transparency. There needs to be more information sharing, and that is something that we're looking for in the future. Is currently, as the portal is, it's only read-only. One of the goals that I would like to see happen is that they would be able to put notes, kind of what DeFlora is doing, is giving us information. When it comes to the life of a child, there should be no boundaries of what is shared to protect our families, and that's something that we're hoping to be able to overcome and just share with more transparency. Anything else for Marcy?
No, you summed it up.
That's it.
All right, thank you so much, New Mexico. Well, it is time for the question and answer, and on your screen, you'll see some reminders. Just either raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can type your question into the Q&A box. We have several questions already. So panelists, I will throw these out there. They don't appear to be directed in all cases to a specific state, but in cases they are, I will identify that. The first question, are you connecting with a single clearinghouse for law enforcement agency data, or are you having to exchange with each agency? Whoever wants to go ahead.
Okay. The question, Florida or New Mexico?
Well, the typer didn't specify, so if you don't know the answer, feel free to say so, and we can always try and follow up afterwards. But if you know the answer, we'd be happy to hear if you're connecting with a single clearinghouse for the law enforcement data, or you're having to exchange with each agency, with the multiple law enforcement agencies.
Well, for Florida, as far as obtaining information, we exchange with basically the central repository for the state of Florida through FDLE for state information. That's how we also connect to the national database with the FBI, III. As far as local law enforcement, like calls to service with each sheriff office or police department, unfortunately, there's not one system for that, and that has been a barrier that we've kind of run into. That Atari kind of mentioned earlier. Those have to be approached literally one by one, and the way we access each local law enforcement agency can be different depending on the agency. But for state and national criminal history, it's one central repository with the State Department of Law Enforcement.
Even with our clerk of court, that's a state centralized thing, but depending upon what you're trying to pull down, there are a few counties that you have to directly access or go to. And so, but they all put it into one statewide system. And we can go in and look at court actions that have occurred, different things that have resulted. And so that access is a lot easier, but it really varies at the local level for different agencies. For instance, in Panama City, Florida, when they just had Hurricane Michael last year, when you look at them, there are about 23 local law enforcement agencies for each little city in that particular area, and then you got your sheriff and so when you look there and they're trying to request local, that family may have moved, so you may have to work it out, who's going to give us, they have to work out locally who's going to give us the information that we need. What's the easiest source of information, whether they have one line for their dispatch or they have two different dispatch facilities as far as maybe their sheriffs are on one and their TPD officers on for us, our local law enforcement on another. And so how that works definitely is different. In some areas they give us access, but when you access their particular system to see how many times they've been out to the home, it shuts down your whole computer, so you're not able to do anything else. And so some of that comes with training. We have to, on our end, work, with several different things that allow that access or, don't allow, or certain individuals have it. And so it just really depends on the database that you're accessing.
Thank you both. We have several other questions. The next question is, could both New Mexico and Florida share the specific state statute which support their collaboration? It may help others pursue similar legislation in their states. And if you don't know the specific statutes, you can send them to me after this, and I can include it in the follow-up email to this webinar, which will include our PowerPoint.
This is Margaret, and basically this is something that was initiated by the governor in the past administration, and the current governor supports this initiative. So basically they can create the guidelines of what we are asked to do and what we need to do.
So it was an executive, in the form of an executive order from the governor.
Okay, thank you. Florida?
In Florida, we shared the first one that led to the NCIC access, the National Criminal History Access, the Adam Walsh Act. And then we also, we have several different statutes, and I will say this, depending upon, I can give you all of the child welfare ones. It does, and I would have to give you that list because it really pertains to what type of information you're trying to access, whether it's related to domestic violence or different things. But the way it really is written in Florida statutes, it's kind of almost a catch-all. And you have to keep in mind that here in Florida, we are an open record state, and so a lot of things that are not easily accessible related to a person's criminal history or any history at all is available here in Florida. So if I'm just a traditional person or someone who's not in the world of child welfare, let me say that, and I want to know whether my neighbor has ever been arrested for something, I could literally go and look that up myself as a citizen of the state. And so I could access that information to know if anybody's ever filed an injunction on him, if anybody, so that's public records. And so that's public information. And so a lot of things we don't have many barriers to because there are public record laws that allow us to have that information.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have a couple more questions. The next one is, I imagine confidentiality of records, and you touched a little bit upon this, confidentiality may have been a barrier. If so, how did you overcome the barrier to sharing this confidential information?
This is New Mexico. I think our memorandum of understanding makes sure that, we covered that. The other thing is that We keep records of every time anybody logs in. So every department that has an MOU has a listserv of who's logging on, who they're looking up. They have to, in order to get credentials, we need a current email, last four of social, and a DOB to make sure that they can have the information. But confidentiality is something that is very important, and it's something that is covered in the MOU. Anything else, you guys? No? That's it.
As I just said, for Florida, we're pretty much an open record state. The most confidential thing here is the child welfare information. That's the thing you can't have access to, not easily accessible. Only certain designated individuals by statute are allowed to have access to that. So if my neighbor wanted to figure that out, my neighbor would have some issue trying to figure out if there was child welfare related information, as it is to anybody in the neighborhood. And so unless they were more so like a relative or someone of that nature, and there's certain things that we're allowed to give them as it relates to if we take certain actions, and there's certain things we're only allowed to release from the child welfare side is if a death occurs. And Florida shares everything related to a child death. And so it just really depends. But for the most part, our records are more confidential than the ones they have to give us. But the access level to nationals is really becomes our biggest challenge because only our PIs are really supposed to look at that information.
Thank you both very much. The next question has to do with funding and how you funded the technology and the exchanges you built in this relationship.
This is New Mexico. Manuel Chacon's going to speak to that question.
Hi, I'm the other half of the digital services team. At the time when we built what ended up being the portal, we didn't really have an idea of how big it was going to get. So we didn't have a budget. We really just leveraged purely open source software and servers and everything else. I mean, we utilized the existing infrastructure that was here, which is like a virtualized environment. So we were able to, get a couple VMs with some open source software, and that was basically it, other than our personal salaries as contractors, but that I can't speak to. But as far as technology goes, I think even to this day, the only thing we're paying for is an enterprise license for GitHub, and that's about $5,000 a year.
The only thing that I would like to add, I'm sorry, go ahead, on the IT, go ahead and finish. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is that part of our plan for sustainability is to secure a formal funding stream for this initiative.
And the other thing that I'd like to add is that basically they talked about the IT part. Everybody else that is a part of this initiative has full-time jobs besides this. I'm the director of the Receiving Center, which houses foster care, that kids that are coming into care. Roxanne has a full-time job, Sandra, Shannon, Doreen, Dave, and, so we are basically kind of working this into our schedule as almost like a volunteering to do it. So that's it from New Mexico.
Okay. So here in Florida, legislatively, as I said earlier, when we get certain things, that, because it's a part of our SACWA system, our updates come or are funded through particularly whatever that need is meeting, or if the legislature made the request, we get within our analysis of what it's going to cost us to do what they're asking us to do. We provide them with an estimate. We go through the company that monitors, that changes our system or enhances our system. We get the analysis of how many billable hours this is going to take to do what they're asking us to do. What do you need? And so we kind of try and think about it that way, from that perspective. Is it doable? And so within that particular request, if it's at that level, of a state mandated request, we've already given them the numbers for what it's going to cost us. Now, sometimes we may have to refrain and stay within those numbers, or even go back the next legislative year to request more funding in order to make that particular another enhancement to it, because we were only able to do so much with what we were given, and or the estimate was a little bit off, and we have to find most times workarounds. And we just typically go from there. And so our enhancements or that we notice that we need to the background check side, we can put in requests for those to be done. They have teams here that evaluate with the level of the need, and they scale them out. Are we going to put billable hours to this? You know, we have the funding for this, and so we get so much funding per year that allows us to modify our system, our state automated system.
All right. Thank you both for those answers. We have time for another question or two, and the next one has to do with data quality and how do you ensure that you are matching on the correct person?
This is Manuel again. I'm sorry, from New Mexico. What we did is, as Jeremy mentioned, we migrated from a traditional, like, hard SQL search that required exact matches to Elasticsearch, which supports a lot of different features for fuzzy type search and wildcards, whether it be multiple characters or also single characters. But we also enable searching via like the city that the particular person could be located in, whether it's a first name or a last name, and we allow just, you know, we'll return all the search results, and it's kind of a trial and error kind of thing for the user. But as you add more filters to our search, you can really narrow it down where it goes. Like, let's say in New Mexico, a really common name is like Juan Martinez, for example. But if you do like Juan Martinez in Roswell, like Juan Martinez alone is going to give you 10,000 search results. But if you do Juan Martinez in Roswell, you're going to get 7 or 10 or something, and you know, you just kind of filter the search results from there.
And in addition, throughout training, we show them how to search. We show them how to look at the addresses. We show them how to look at what we call related people, all the participants in the case, to help them find a common denominator to help them determine, did you find the right person you're looking for? So we really emphasize how to search throughout our training.
So in Florida, verification of the individual is a little different because we're getting for the purposes of background checks. So Florida has a few ways that we can do for certain types of checks depending upon what system you're accessing. We try and it's also incorporated in training for staff, for field staff. How do you verify information, whether that be getting that person's ID or, as we talked about David earlier, which is our driver's license and vehicle registration system, which we have access to. That information at the intake level gets pulled. The hotline is the first source of running the first initial checks with the information that is provided or that they can find based off their searches using other systems as well. David is one of the first systems that they also use. So if an investigator looks at that, they can go out to the home knowing who they're actually looking for, having a picture of the person named in that report, having the type of vehicle that vehicles that they've had registered to their name, being, you know, whether that's in the yard or something like that. In Florida, someone could call in a report using only someone's tag number as a means to locate. And so we have different systems that allow us to get our investigators to that home to identify that child and those families. And so they can do that. They can, you know, they ask for driver's license, they do various other things. Then you have, when it relates to placements and different things of that nature, that level of criminal checks and verification of information requires the use of fingerprints. Because, you know, just as you said, you can have people, various people with the same name or using their fathers. They could be junior and using senior information. So the only way at that point to verify certain individuals, especially when it relates to placement in care or different concerns, that they are through fingerprints of the individual.
All right, thank you. We have a question specific to New Mexico about metrics and outcomes. For New Mexico, do you have any metrics to share about law enforcement usage of the portal? And have you correlated usage of the tool with positive safety outcomes for children and families?
This is Irene from New Mexico. So we do have metrics on usage that we track. However, from a program law enforcement perspective, I don't think that we're tracking those outcomes.
No.
That would certainly be something that we want to start doing, and we'll need to just do more discovery on that and investigate further.
That's part of the future, the vision, and moving forward.
All right, thank you so much. Sounds like you have an idea what to work on next. We have one last question, and then we'll wrap this thing up. What data quality checks and rules do you enforce, if any, when performing data exchange? Do you reject any data?
For New Mexico, that's not really applicable. We don't ingest any data from external sources. We're strictly the source, so that's it.
So we here in Florida, we do submit the information to law enforcement, and yes, they will reject the data on our end. If they notice, so for instance, if we have only the name and date of birth, they will tell us, hey, that comes back on our rap sheet, so the criminal sheet. We possibly have this potential person that might match, but Social Security is needed, Social Security number is needed to verify that this is the appropriate individual. And so in those types of cases where maybe not all of the information is had or known at the time of the intake coming into the hotline, then they are required to rerun that information within 48 hours and get updated checks on those individuals within that home, or if they go to the home and they didn't realize that other individuals who were in that home that were not known to the reporter, they're required to update and run those updated background checks within a specific period of time. If we submit fingerprints and those prints, we get prints that get rejected all the time, or information that gets rejected, and so we've got to redo it. We've got to rerun it. And so we have different requirements that they ask, but I can let Travis elaborate on that if you want.
No, I think she covered it. I think she covered it well. Now, I'm not sure if logging was part of that question. I don't have the questions in front of me, but we are required to log all our transactions, and we're also required to log to be compliant with the siege security policy in case there's an incident in the technical world, a breach, that type of thing. So we have to log both technically and from our workloads, what folks are actually accessing.
All right. Well, thank you both states and everyone who participated. This has been a fabulous panel. Learned a lot, and really want to extend our appreciation to New Mexico and Florida for taking the time to answer these questions and provide some information about your unique exchanges. Really something to keep an eye on how they develop over time. For any of the attendees on the phone, if you'd like to contact any of the panelists, their contact information is listed on the slide you see now.
Email addresses are as follows. Travis Polk, email travis.paulk@myflfamilies.com. Atari Hall, email atarri.hall@myflfamilies.com. Margaret Aragon de Chavez, email margaret.aragondechavez at state.nm.us. Sandra R. Gallegos, email sandra.gallegos, 2, at state.nm.us. Irene Lutgen, email irene.luettgen at state.nm.us. And David Ramirez, email david.ramirez at state.nm.us.
We, again, will be making this available through the listserv after this webinar. The webinar has been recorded and will be made available online. When it is complete and posted, a message will be sent announcing availability on the Children's Bureau website. And as we move forward, our next webinar in the series will be about the ESSA Act, Education in Every Student Succeeds. We're currently targeting late September for that. Thank you, everyone, and have a fabulous day.